Hi, and welcome to Art in Focus. My name is Natalie Heath, and I'm the Director of Education at South Shore Arts. And tonight I'm going to be joined with Kate Humphreys. And Kate, are you there? I'm going to unmute you and just get there she is.
Here I am.
There she
Hello.
is. Well, again, welcome everybody. My name is Natalie Heath, Director of Education for South Shore Arts. Welcome to Art in Focus. And we're going to be talking about the history of children's book illustration tonight. And we're so lucky to be joined with Kate Humphreys of Ali Ali Oxen Free Books, both online, Etsy, and Instagram, right?
Yep, all three.
And she has been somebody who I don't know personally. We haven't really known each other besides about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And the thing about it is, though, is I've known who she is for quite a while because I've been following her page on Instagram for quite some time. So her page on Instagram is a lot like her Etsy page. And just to clarify, on your Etsy page, is it children's books and other children's items? Vintage children's items?
Every once in a while, I've kind of shifted focus more towards this my new website that's listed first,
Hmm.
which is just books, new and old picture books. But
Wonderful.
on the Etsy side, I think there are some clothes, some toys, things like that.
Right. So these are two links, both to AliAliOxenFreeBooks.com, where you can find her really beautifully curated collection of vintage children's books. And at the beginning of this presentation, we started with a short little video of one of my favorite children's books, and one that I keep. You can see behind me some of my collection itself, and that was Colors Are Nice by, oh boy, Leonard Shortall. How about that, from 1962? And this is a book that I've had forever. And when I was very small, the books, or this book with the pictures in it, it was easy to read. It was something that I could read to my grandma or she could read to me. And the pictures for me have become iconic, and resonate through a lot of my own artwork even till today. Is how did you come up with the Ali Ali Oxenfree name for your brand? How did you choose that?
I think that I liked the poetry, the like rhythm of Ollie Ollie Oxenfree, and I was reading this book that's called The Language and Lore of School Children,
Mhm.
is like all of the rhymes that you make up when you're a kid and how they kind of get passed along from kid to kid rather than adult to adult. It's sort of this child culture that
Mhm.
gets passed through children. And I think Ollie Ollie Oxenfree is one of those phrases that gets passed from kid to kid. And it's like an exclamation of joy. It's like, freedom and everybody come out. If you're not familiar with the phrase, it's when you're playing hide and go seek and you've given up and you want everyone to come out from their hiding place. So I just thought it sounded nice, and I liked sort of the background of it.
Yeah, it's almost sort of one of those sing-songy old world rhymes, kind of like Ring Around the Rosie. And
Yeah.
so Ali Ali Oxenfree, for those that do speak German, I think it's pronounced Ali Ali Oxenfree, which is everyone also is free. So it is a come together where it's kind of like an even ground to start on. It's very sweet. Kate has a master's in library science. She is a librarian and she works regular. Do you work? How about now? Do you work regularly with kids during COVID, or is it most has it slowed down quite a bit?
Slow down. Yeah, there's less. We haven't had story time. There's less kids coming to the library for sure.
Hmm.
We do like a virtual story time.
And I bet I bet that's it's a bummer for the kids who can't participate, and I know it's a bummer for you to be able to not have that experience, because I'm certain anybody who loves and appreciates children's book literature, even as you grow, that joint experience of those stories and the illustrations that go along with it, it's good communication, it's good connection. And so I'd ask Kate, how's the master's in library science benefited your love for children's literature and illustration in the job during not COVID times when you're able to interact with children and be around those? How has that impacted you?
Yeah. So what my response was that I sort of came already loving children's literature just from a artistic perspective, just
Mm-hmm.
loving the object of picture books. It's kind of what drove me to become a librarian.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason. But what I think I learned in library school is that practically it's a really charged experience between a kid and an adult, where you're not only reading the story, but you get to engage them and ask questions and um, have them sort of lead their experience and their learning.
Hmm.
So you can sort of be the guide. You can say, what do you think is happening in this picture? And they get to answer the question themselves. They get to think about, what is happening in this picture? What do I see?
Hmm.
So it's sort of a way to offer a kid their own license to learn without, having to be told facts and figures or whatever. They're actually experiencing, um, what they think is going on for maybe the first time.
Hmm.
So I think
There's
that's
there's some that is very cool, and I love the thought too that even though some might be experiencing it for the first time, the enjoyment of getting the same book read to you over and over again of one that you enjoy, that's good stuff.
mm-hmm.
And it solidifies that learning. So first of all, I wanted to say thanks to Kate on her Instagram when going through there. When I knew she was good people is when I saw, and you'll see my cursor moving around, this picture in the back of Fyodor Rojankovsky. Please forgive my pronunciation. However, that image right there is one of the most iconic for me. In fact, I still keep it right here. I love it absolutely so much. I knew she was good people because she recognized that image. So that way, that thank you for that. Did you have this book growing up?
I didn't. A lot of these like older books are just ones I've discovered through my love of illustration. No, I didn't have this one growing up.
And so you are about, I think, 10 years younger than I am. And so my experience with books, I was lucky to have grandmothers who even kept some of their children's books. And so I think I have experience seeing kind of like old world illustrations and some of those originals. And one of that Kate and I were talking about, this is a one of original illustrated children's verses by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this was my grandma's. And so we had a lot of old books like this, but also because of that, she really embraced the love of reading and the importance of children's literature and children's book illustration. And so that I think is where a lot of my love and appreciation came from. And so the reason when I say it's a reasonably short history, it really is kind of a we haven't been here that long, and even in that small amount of time, so much has happened. That's what I think makes it seem super short. And so Kate and I also were talking about the ever-changing technology and how that's impacted storytelling, children's book literature, and how it's promoted. Photography, film, animation, digital media, it impacts our ability for mass and source content. And so before we go to the next slide, actually, Kate, when you are actively working with children and you're reading stories, do you find that maybe kind of like new kids now are a little more impatient and they want that kind of like digital media aspect of it? Or do you find that kids still kind of revert to that story time quietness?
I think both are true. I think if a story's content is good enough and the imagery is engrossing enough, a kid will be completely silent for as long as you're reading the story. But I also think that when you're maybe reading a longer story that they feel less connected to, there's definitely a shorter attention span than I think
Mm-hmm.
maybe would have been longer once upon a time.
Yeah, oh, that's a good point. And um, the whole thing with illustration and kind of like the boom of that, it was also kind of a booming of the understanding of age appropriate content. And so, and some of that goes, I think, with what kids can handle and tolerate per their level. And I make that connection only to this Robert Louis Stevenson book because I'm not really sure what the printing number of this is. But if you look in the back, it's part of something called the Young People's Library, where it's got a Peter Rabbit series, and it's also got some longer chapter books in it. Um, and I think that along with technology, there was also kind of a shift in children reading longer books. It's a weird dichotomy where the technology might kind of take and strip away a little of that patience. Yet those same kids will sit down and read a 12 chapter Harry Potter.
Yeah.
So, however they're getting it, but when you sit down and read Harry Potter without the images that have been made in movies, they were picturing those on their own. And so, if we're going to talk about children's illustration and just kind of start early on, a theme that I noticed, and I'm sure Kate knows about too, it seems like a lot of children's stories. And by the way, we're not talking about children's stories only that originated in Europe and reasonably close countries such as that. We're talking about, I want to acknowledge the fact that stories, morals, fables, lessons, there's a lot that exists from many cultures, and they seem to be cross-cultural in some of the crux of the issues. Tonight, though, we are gonna be focusing a little bit on some of the European basis for that with the Brothers Grimm and also just some artists that really it hadn't occurred to me until I started to conduct this lecture, and Kate and I touched on this, how much of this history is rooted in privilege and the ability to have access to not only education, but the ability to enjoy childhood and how that impacts your status and your learning and just you as human culture, right?
Mhm.
And so also with these morals and with these morals and fables, they almost served a little bit more to be lessons taught from fear or warning. Did you ever come across in any of your collecting books that you think that's harsh?
Oh, absolutely. I think most books from before like 1910 are going to be like morally trying to get a child to do something rather than telling them a story. It's a story about how if they don't behave, they're going to get their fingers chopped off, or
Yeah.
they're going to die in a terrible fire or something.
Do you have a book that stood out to you that kind of made you think a little bit? Like, I'm looking around right now and see if I can find it. I have a Berenstain Bear book from the early 80s where they had to go get a tooth filled, or they were pulling a tooth or something like that. That book scared the heck out of me and made me feel like it was going to be okay all in one day. So, do you have one book or two books that stand out to you?
As warning books.
But in a good way, not one. Do you have one that scared you?
Um, Not that I can recall, but I will say that we were talking about Edward Gorey. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
anybody's familiar with Edward Gorey, but he made a career of sort of making fun of that, of making fun of the moral tales, and he
Mm-hmm.
does it in sort of a really macabre, um, scary way, to the point of it being funny. I think he's trying to be entertaining and funny.
Are you
Uh,
saying his last name is Gory?
yeah.
Well, what choice did he have? He had to do that, right?
I will say, we talk a lot in the library space about windows and mirrors now,
Hmm.
meaning that it's more of a shift, it's shifted from this like moral idea to wanting children to see themselves in the book, to see themselves either um, in a mirror, or for it to be a window to seeing other people.
I like that. It's a way to kind of, while those books kind of guide you to make choices, it's a different way of seeing yourself and seeing others too, and kind of the way that you would coexist. And so this slide here, my friends, is um, without going too much into it. I think that without talking about advancing, we talk about the short history. It all kind of happened in a short amount of time thanks to the printing press, which I didn't realize was what, like 400 or 500 years ago. I thought it was a lot more recent. But even the most archaic ones from 1450, it had an engraving and casting type of style that allowed for the printing of words and really basic engraved media. And so and I learned this too, that Francis Bacon actually said that the three most important or impactful inventions, good, bad, or indifferent, that's up to you to decide, that have impacted human culture are gunpowder, the nautical compass, and also the printing press. And the fact that printing allowed for information to grow, be distributed, I think says a lot for the way not only stories were passed down, the access to information, And also, I had remembered learning this in art school about Martin Luther. I saw this quote: "Printing was the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one." And so, when he had, I guess, translated the Bible for the New Testament and had access to the printing press, the amount of copies that were able to be distributed because of that, just and we're going to put it into perspective with the little golden books and how many books they were able to print within a very short amount of time. It's insane. And it changed. And even though it seems so long ago, it's just a blip of an eye where the short amount of time things drastically changed. Do you know what I mean? What in your teachings or in your schooling do you remember learning about the printing press do you remember kind of talking about the importance of that at all?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's the reason that Christianity spread the way it did, for sure. Um, I think what we talked about more in my history of children's literature class is uh, those first, at the very beginning, they'd have like dime novels, that people could buy on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some of the first books for children were like dime ABC books that you could purchase on the street.
Do you know how
So
long ago that was or what about years that might have been?
I wish I remembered, but around that like 1600s time, at the very, near the time of the creation of the printing press.
I actually read something kind of interesting, um, just recently, in fact, about, the printing press giving a lot of access to information, even still within that ilk of people, even with that available information, newspapers, political stories getting out, not everybody knew how to read. And so a real social aspect is this one person, an orator would come out there and read the front page and spin it how they wanted, and that spread belief, whether we're talking about religion or we're talking about politics. So, what's kind of interesting in this short story, the short history, just very basic. So we start back with the printing press. We'll skip a couple decades and just kind of move on. But progressively, the idea of political cartoons really kind of changed things a little bit. It put a little humor on it. It allowed people to poke fun. But boy, is there a rich history in kind of who was allowed to spread the information, who was allowed to kind of tart up the information, and what the illustrations were allowed to really get away with. And so just kind of starting here where my mouse is circling around here with one illustrator that comes up, and I loved it. I was talking to Kate the other day, kind of going through our presentation, and she said to me, she was like, "This is good. This reminds me of a lot of presentations I've seen before." And at first I was like, "Oh God, I don't want to hear that." But at the same time, if it's a really linear kind of like um, map that shows this real interesting guide to how we got to this point now. And so, with Isaac Cruikshank, he was in the late 1790s, and he was known for poking a lot of fun at Napoleon. And his son, actually, here next to him, good old George Cruikshank, say that 10 times fast, he also participated and did a lot with political cartoons. And he had no trouble whatsoever being one of the first people to be able to do political cartoons that poked fun at the monarchy. Or the king. I guess it wasn't, you know what I mean? At that time, King George the I'm looking here at my time. So if we've got King George the Fourth over here in 1893, okay, so King George the Second possibly. But I say all that because, whoop, I'm gonna go back here. I say all that to say, if you see me moving my cursor, it's because I'm getting the chat window out of the way, my friends. So between 1823 here, I'm going to circle it, and 1893, a lot of things had happened, and I'm going to throw a little bit of information at you that might sound a little bit disjointed, but bear with me here. So in 1823, George Cruikshank, the son of Isaac, also continued to make political cartoons, starting a little bit more to poke at the powers that be. In 1893, John Tenniel, I believe is his name, he actually was bribed with knighthood to not illustrate King George IV in an unflattering light. And so that kind of tells you a little bit about the power of media and kind of all the manipulation and things that might have gone on there politically. And
What I know as far as this time period is that there was this big push in the idea of what childhood was.
mm,
I think right during this period, it's called the romantic philosophy, is when there's a shift from thinking that children were born inherently evil
mm,
to believing that children were born inherently good and that they were shaped by society to be bad. So I think that the way that media was presented to kids changed at that time too. It was less moral fables, and
Hmm.
then it turned to telling fairy tales and stories that engaged them.
Could we go ahead and maybe agree a little bit that with here in 1826, when the first translation of German popular stories by the Brothers Grimm came out and people had access to that, even though those stories themselves have a lot of spooky kind of connotation to them, it wasn't quite as harsh as somebody we're going to talk about here in a minute. It allowed for a little spooky whimsy with a message in there that told you shouldn't take food from a stranger. Not to say some Brothers Grimm stories are terrifying, but we'll talk about them a little bit more. So after 1893, we're going to move here to, and by the way, somewhere in here too, Maria Montessori was existing and making her mark and talking about how children learn through experience. And part of that experience is seeing, and I love the way illustrations guide literature and kind of, it's just another way to make kids think and independently think and make choices. But Beatrix Potter, what can you tell us about her? We know you love her work.
Um, I think that she's cool because she approached it. She was a scientist before she was an illustrator, so
Mm.
she's coming from this um, love, deep love of nature and animals, and knowing them anatomically, and knowing their place in the natural world.
Mhm.
But then she's making these stories to engage children in the natural world, where she's putting a hedgehog in a suit and having them you know um, have a dinner party or whatever it is happening in that story.
Yeah.
um,
That was it anthropomorphic kind of, was she one that started that maybe a little bit? Or you think sometimes political cartoons with the Democrat Republican elephant, kind of thing, donkey. Makes you wonder.
yeah, I'm not sure if she started it, but it was in the zeitgeist. She was a heavy leader and participant in that anthropomorphism that was
Hmm.
very popular during the Victorian era.
Well, and speaking of the Victorian era, we've got these last three sections here. We talk about Walter Crane with nursery rhymes, which I'm certain is kind of synonymous with the time and date of this book that I have here. Um, this is when, and Beatrix Potter certainly is definitely in this selection here that I'm about to mention, with children's book illustration, especially in like the 1800s, there was a collection of artists, which I didn't realize. You think about children's illustration or illustration anyway today, there are thousands of people. Anybody could illustrate a children's book. Back then, though, there weren't as many. And so the idea of iconic imagery starts to set in a little bit now in our presentation, where we all are going to start having a joint experience. Our great grandparents, the original ones who saw Beatrix Potter, or even before that. But it's almost like the telephone game. It gets a little diluted each time, but we still have the basis for iconic imagery that now, and not in addition to sharing these stories, now we share these images that go along with it.
On a
And
mass scale, yeah,
say that again.
on a mass scale, on a bigger scale than that has ever existed before.
Ever existed. So, speaking of the Brothers Grimm, I feel a little silly. I guess for whatever reason, I just have always thought that they were, because their last name is Grimm, I just thought that they were these two little spooky brothers that lived in the Black Forest, spending their whole life just spinning yarns and crazy stories and made these crazy things up. Where in fact, they are two brothers. They were historians and academics who just basically Europe, what am I trying? How far, do you know how far their reach might have been?
I mean,
Northern Europe? Hmm?
I think that it's mostly northern, Germany
Yes. I did
and Sweden and stuff like that.
exactly. So I didn't realize how they had gone around and kind of gleaned these stories and how they then rewrote them to some of the stories that we know today. And so these cautionary advice, these stories that steer children towards age appropriate, well, that's more for the books. I will say this, that I didn't realize how many stories they had their fingers in bringing to the masses. Stories like Hansel and Gretel, Rumpelstiltskin, which always scared me. I did not like that story. The Pied Piper, The Little Mermaid, which I always think is just so cool. And Edmund Dulac, which illustrated the picture in front of you, I can go back to the last slide actually and show you, it's real small. He illustrated here for The Little Mermaid. But in this slide here, this is the original story for Cinderella, who originally is called The Little Ash Girl. And it wasn't until a couple days ago I put that together, Little Ash Girl and Cinderella.
I've never put that together either.
Hey, I imagine that there's a few people today watching who are like, whoa, wait a minute. All right, and speaking of cautionary tales, this is a fun little slide that I wanted to add just because I couldn't help myself. So Heinrich Hoffman, did you know much about him kind of like historically before you and I started talking, like anything other than just sort of in jest?
Just slovenly Peter here. That's it.
Yeah. So Heinrich Hoffman, he was a doctor or a dentist. He had a slew of kids, and one of the things that he enjoyed doing was writing stories for his kids, and just about a various amount of characters that kind of kept them in line, but in a funny way. And so my understanding too is that he had like a compendium of books that had different like short stories in it and characters. And one of his characters here is this hat looking fella here called Struwelpeter. And Struwelpeter, also known as Sloppy Pete or Slovenly Pete, he, I believe, is a book about short stories, things you shouldn't do. Don't be like Sloppy Pete. Brush your hair, cut your nails, brush your teeth, sit up straight, don't spit your food out. And so he also wrote about this guy here, and I'm not going to say much more about it because we're going to do something kind of fun today at Art in Focus that we hadn't done. But his written and verbal narratives, they terrified children, but yet entertained, which makes me think about the advanced humor of Pixar today. Do you know what I mean? It's not scaring kids, but yet it's got kind of an adult theme to it that kids and children can enjoy.
Right. I will say that Struwelpeter was the inspiration for Edward Scissorhands. If you see the
Oh,
resemblance.
yeah? GIF. Okay. This is a comment made by somebody on a television show that most people know, talking about Struwelpeter.
And now, a very special treat. A book my grandmother used to read me when I was a kid. This is a very special story. It's called Struwelpeter by Heinrich Hoffmann from 1864. The great tall tailor always comes to little girls that suck their thumbs. Are you listening, Sasha? Right? And ere they dream what he's about, he takes his great sharp scissors out and then cuts their thumbs clean off, kid.
It's Dwight Schrute, the one and only lovable guy who's proof of what happens when you are read these stories from a really young age. But just a little humor here, but it's funny and interesting how things get translated. Now, do you think that the scissor man who takes the thumbs of kids that suck their thumb off was Edward Scissorhand or Struwelpeter with the long fingernails?
Maybe a mixture of both. I'm not sure.
All spooky. So this is an illustration by Edmund Dulac, and one of the stories that he illustrated for. Do you know what this one is off the top of your head? Do you think you could pick what story this is from, Kate?
Princess and the Pea.
Yeah, I really love that story. And this picture, it makes it seem so fanciful and elegant. And
Yeah.
Kate and I actually were talking a little bit about this time also being another example of a signifier of status, what it meant to have access to these stories, not necessarily stories, but the actual physical books, to be able to have access to this knowledge. And during this time, up until you were talking a little bit about the Victorian age and the area of the Romanticism and kind of this. And it's an encouraging phase to be able to let kids kind of learn through experience and being coddled in a loving kind of way. And so instead of terrifying and warning children, books and illustrations were seen as learning tools, where illustrations enhanced understanding and introduced whimsy. And you were talking about books that had kind of, you called it a didactic feel, where it was really, explain what that means.
Just meaning that it's meant to teach them something, like an ABC book, a 1, 2, 3 book, um, a book about colors,
Mhm.
um, less than it being about a story.
Okay. So real direct, you know, a lot of the when you think about illustrations, some things accompany the words, others guide the words, and then other times you end up with books like this one we were talking about that maybe we'll have a chance to talk about a little bit more in advance here. But the Chris Van Allsburg series, for those of you who don't know, they're not simple illustrations. They are though just black and white. And they do come with a little bit of a written piece to it, but even still, just books with pictures like this can send the imagination all sorts of really cool places. I kind of prefer that. Would you prefer a book with all pictures or a book with some pictures and some writing?
I think the interplay is where the magic happens.
Nice. And I wanted to talk about little golden books because little golden books, I think, are something that most people know, have had access to, have given as a gift, have used themselves. They're iconic. And Little Golden Books, they started in 1942, and it was seen kind of out of a need for children to have access to books that were cheap, durable, vibrant, and available to everyone. They were level appropriate. They were books that you could read to your child, but also they could read back to you. They were books that were for the first time available in grocery stores and were at a price that I believe at that time 25 cents that most middle income families could afford. Um, let's see, do you have a lot of these when you were little? Were these part of your collection?
For sure. Yeah. And I also will add that that's also a period when people were understanding the importance of early literacy, how important getting your kid to read at a very young age was.
And I think too, part of that, not just reading to kids, but having them read back to you is so important a little bit. So this is just a really brief timeline, and it starts in 1942. And I just wanted to give you a little history because we all have seen these books. I'm sure we all still might have some for our families, if not just to keep them because you love them. But it's kind of just a simple little run through. So in 1942, they started at 25 cents. And within the first 5 months, they had already entered their third printing of, let's see, I think it was The Pokey Little Puppy. And within that small amount of time, 1.5 million copies were already sold. And so in 1944, though, in a short amount of time, and we'll talk a little bit about this in depth, they partnered with Disney. And that took them off in a lot of directions. Every character had a book. You know, and there's that whole thing with technology too of animation happening at the same time and what that meant for partnering with the book. It's a lovely thing. But we were talking a little, we'll get back into that about how little golden books might have gotten a little ahead of themselves. So in 1950, though, that kind of in that same theme, as wonderful as they are, this is when they started product placement. And it was with Dr. Dan, the Band-Aid man, I think is what he was called, the Doctor Man. And they had a Johnson & Johnson Band-Aid that came with it. And already in 1952, 100, the mind just boggles, 183 million different books were sold. And the first year in 1942, 12 books were issued, and I've got those in the next slide. But in 1962, within 20 years, they had gone up 4 cents. And by 1967, they'd already sold 200 million books. 1971 is a marker that I wanted to mention because I think it's a really important one with Little Golden Books. It's when they partnered with Sesame Street. And Sesame Street is such an important and iconic thing in existence. They have done so much for multicultural purposes and bringing everybody into the fold and making everybody feel included. And where I think Golden Books had kind of literacy and books for all, Sesame Street had learning for all. And even though they're product heavy and Grover's got 1,000 books, like the monster at the end of this book, he there's something a little bit less body about Sesame Street than Disney for me. Do you feel that way too, Kate?
Absolutely. I mean, the purpose of Sesame Street is for learning and learning not only didactically, like we were talking about, but like social emotionally.
Yeah.
Well,
Yep. And also, just sorry to interrupt you, but also just to see outside yourself. I think that's the difference between Sesame Street and Disney. It's not you can see outside yourself a lot better. So, again, that's a whole other art and focus. Come back. So, in 1977, they've gone up to 59 cents. In 82, about the time I started to come to town, 89 cents. The Pokey Little Puppy And I'm going to bring up my copy here. So, and I learned a lot. And if anybody here after the fact would like to learn more from myself or Kate about how to find out whether or not the book that you have is a treasure or if it's just kind of a one you might find in mass at a garage sale, it's all about the binding. But in 1986, the Pokey Little Puppy sold 1 billion copies. That's crazy. So much so the Smithsonian in 1992 welcomed them into the fold for just acknowledgement. In 2022, $5 for one of those books. That seems excessively high. Um, and a couple things I didn't mention too. In 1974, Barbie was integrated into it. And then also I read about how they were used on the Bozo and the Howdy Doody show, but also Annie Oakley books. Isn't that so of the time? And of that first, these are the first 12 books that came out in 1942. And so I tried as much as I possibly could to get the original covers on here. And so you might recognize a few of these. And Little Golden Books have been really, really good about reissuing books every 10 or 15, 25 years to mark an important due date for them or an important date for them. And so these were the first 12. Did you have any of these? Were any of these on your favorite list?
I definitely had Pokey Little Puppy,
Yep.
but I had The Animals of Farmer Jones too.
Good for you. I had The Little Red Hen was always a really important book, and this one here is kind of an offshoot of the Pokey Little Puppy. And if you get a chance to see this, it's a hardcover kind of cardboard book. It's his counting book. The illustrations in this are amazing. I just love, love, love them. All right, so now, just kind of briefly, I wanted to talk about the Caldecott Award. And this was something I remember learning in elementary school because you'd go to the library and you'd get to pick out what book you wanted to take home for the day or the week. And you were encouraged to find books that had either the Newbery decal on it, emblem medal, or the Caldecott. And the Caldecott Award is awarded to books for recognition and illustration, which is what we're talking about today. And so in 1938, the award was invented in honor of Randolph Caldecott, who had been an illustrator really well known in the late 1800s. And so it's given an excellence of execution in the artistic technique employed, just means that they did it really well and they knew their materials. And then also the delineation of plot, theme, and characters. It went side by side linearly with the story and enhanced the experience. In these pictures here, not only do we have examples of the emblem, but you have an example of the first one given called Animals of the Bible by Dorothy Lathrop, and that was in 1938. And then Me and Mama by Cosby Cabrera, which was just recently in 2021 one of the winners. Do you incorporate these medals as part of the experience when teaching about books? Do you talk about the history of children's book illustration and what makes a great book great?
For sure. The Caldecott is like the if a book has a Caldecott award, it means that it has to be in your collection for sure. It means it's a very important book to have. And just
Going through my collection, I saw that I have 6 versions of Blueberries for Sale. Anyway, because I'm an 80s kid and from what I gather, Kate, you're a 90s kid, right? So we kind of accept we kind of like you can continue the story after this because I think mid to late 80s is sort of where my children's book illustration fervor kind of ended. But the cool thing about it was, and I'll just mention this, well, I'll hold off on this little story, but first I digress. In the 80s, I think where my transition kind of started was when my interaction with some more technology came in. And one of the things that I really loved, because I still loved books, still loved to read out loud and be read to, there was something called the Electronic Talk and Play, which also partnered with Little Golden Books and Sesame Street. They might have partnered with Disney later, but one thing on here, what it would do is you'd put these little tapes in, you'd put your book up here, and then you'd press play and you'd read along. And these buttons here, you would interact like a choose your own adventure. It was pretty neat. And this one right here was called Don't Push the Red Button. So basically, you just spent the whole book irritating Grover and pushing the red button. It was awesome. How do you feel about technology? What do you think that says for um, children's books handheld? What does that
I
mean?
think
What do you think?
I think it can be used for, as with all technology, it can be used for good or for bad. Um, we have these books at the library where you can actually press a button on the book and it will read it to you. So
Hmm.
this is still being employed, this technique, which I think is great, especially for kids that are struggling
Hmm.
with learning the words or
Yeah.
want some help. I think that that's excellent. I don't think there's anything wrong with this form, but I will say I'm pretty anti ebook picture book.
Yeah. They have their place as long as I don't think they replace everything. Do you know what I mean?
Right, which I don't think they're going to.
This right here is just a taste of my personal collection. And what I was going to mention a minute ago but held off on is so I had gone away to college. I came back, and my grandma said something to the effect of go downstairs and there's a box down there. And when I brought it back up, she had kept 99% of every book I'd ever had. And the ones that I didn't get to keep, I've collected over the years to kind of complete my collection. But there is nothing to me, it's like that's more satisfying than being surrounded by these. And I keep a good amount of these books out during in my house just to kind of see them because their images are so sweet. And these were the ones that are on my personal collection and favorites. Maybe you guys have seen these too. Didn't even realize that my Big Honey Hunt was the first Berenstain Bears book. And also, for Kate, I really wish you were here right now because I know you also love Richard Scarry. Let me tell you what, the scratch and sniffs, you can
Yeah.
still get in there and really kind of like band-aids, oranges.
Quite
just
smell like they're
just
supposed
like
to smell.
childhood. And so here we go. I wanted to have a moment for Kate to talk about this. I love this image so much. And I had asked her what some of her earliest memories about children's book illustration and the importance of those were to her. And so this, take it from here.
Sure, yeah. So my granddad was an artist when I was a kid, not professionally. He was a dentist professionally, but he would paint and he loved writing letters to me in calligraphy pens.
Mm.
So he one year for Christmas or birthday, some gift giving holiday, he gave me a set of professional artist calligraphy pens. And I remember using them to recreate Beatrix Potter illustrations. For whatever reason, those were the ones I felt most drawn to and wanted to draw in my notebook. So
There's
that's
something
definitely my earliest memory of children's illustration are these characters.
there's something really refined and sweet about these pictures. And you had mentioned when you had wrote me an email about the just a goose in a bonnet.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that because the line work is so obvious, is so you can see where the line ends. It's not
Hmm.
watercolor or something. I think that that's what drew me to it. It was like, oh, I can see the line. I could recreate that. I can see where the line goes.
That's what I mean. And if you, as somebody who teaches children how to draw, I always break things down into everything's a line, everything's a simple shape. And in its simplicity, it's just really excellent. So the next slide, contemporary children artists, or sorry, children's illustrators that you should know. I always like to end Art and Focus by asking my guests about artists that they think are important that are contemporary. We could talk all day about the history, the the short yet vast history of children's book illustration. I could do an entire art and focus just about Edmund Dulac or the Berenstain Bears. But tonight she had given me a couple names, and I'm gonna turn this over to you for a little bit, and tell me a little bit about Mitsumasa Ano.
Sure. So Mitsumasu Ano, he was more popular in the 90s,
Mhm.
and I grew up looking at these books. He writes mostly wordless picture books, where it's an entire spread of a village or like a farmer's market or something of that nature, and you're like zooming in and looking at every little tiny detail, which I really loved. I loved getting it's sort of a non-guided Where's Waldo. There's
I
no
was
one
thinking that.
telling you to find anything, but you are doing it anyways on your own.
Yes.
Um, so he's Japanese, but was really drawn to like medieval Western world stuff. So
Okay.
a lot of the stuff he draws is sort of
English Tudor
medieval.
style.
Yeah.
Um, no words necessarily, but 100 stories going on in there all at once.
Yeah. This Beatrice Alimagna, I think is how you pronounce her name. She's
Mhm.
Italian. She's contemporary. She's writing books for today. I just love not only the stories that she's telling are really contemporary stories, like um, the Magical Do Nothing Day. That first one that is written down there is
Mhm.
all about a kid she's got nothing to do. Her video game won't work. It's raining outside. So she decides to go discover what she can find outside. And she goes on this magical journey, which I think is really beautiful. But her drawings are just they are so blended and whimsical and sort of like she gets in just like tiny, tiny, beautiful details that I find really enthralling.
I thought
So
this
I
story was really effective because it's a story about, like you said, the little girl who is outside on a cold, wet day, kind of experiencing the northwest of America woods. It's very damp, lots of trees, lots of wet. And the pictures really, especially with the watercolor, I think they accompany each other so nicely. Good choice.
Yeah. John Klassen, he's one of the more famous big illustrators right now. He's famous for this one called I Want My Hat Back, which I'm pretty sure won a Caldecott. It's very sparse, and he's also an author, and his books have very dry humor and often use really interesting, cool art tactics. Like one page will be very, very dark, and then the next page will be all in red and is meant to emote anger or fear or um, he's using a lot of art techniques to get feelings across rather than writing them into the story. A lot of unconscious communication, which
And
I
I
think.
love that it's multimedia. I think that's something that is so helpful when teaching kids art and practices and having children's book illustrations as examples of whatever art technique we're trying to show kind of bridges the gap, I think, a little bit with their understanding because it's done in a way that a child appreciates. You know, there's a lot of, there's a lot of, this inspires me, is basically what I'm saying. Let's make some art. Carson Ellis.
Carson Ellis, she is very, very wonderful. She does a lot of gouache illustrations.
Mhm.
Um, she also is an author in this Do Is Talk book that's down in the corner. I think I have right here. It's all written in nonsense words, nonsensical language. Um, but through the illustrations, you understand what's going on. A lot of them are wordless, a lot of the pages, but then there's a page like this says, Tata Udas, Tata Iki, Tata Uki. And what's cool about this is that the child then has to understand what's going on their own. They have to figure out based on the way that the facial expressions are behaving or the way the illustration is moving, what's happening, which I think
Hmm.
is a really welcome thing for a kid, again, to engage their understanding of storytelling.
I
So she's
really
really awesome.
I
Love her.
love to I love her style. I don't mean to just kind of wrap that up in a really easy little like, oh, I like her art, but I mean she really has a style that is so I'm going to use a word I don't like, but I'm going to use it. Are you ready? It's kind of precious.
It is precious.
Speaking of precious, look at these little cuties.
Okay, yeah, Christian Robinson he wrote, his big one is called Last Stop on Market Street.
Mm.
And he's really cool because he's presenting um, mostly in city environments, urban
Mhm.
environments, kids that live in cities, a lot of multicultural presentation of kids. Like you see, there's a kid in the wheelchair
Yep.
down there. Um, he does this like collage style, which I think is really neat. It's very like childlike, which I think kids recognize and are attracted to.
You know, there's a lot to be said too about, and again, one more topic for another later art and focus. Something I always go back to with why are things appealing, not just because of art elements and principles. I go back to synesthesia and why certain colors have flow with certain words, and I just have a feeling that this one marries really well. And so that is a big topic. So, ladies and gentlemen, the next slide is going to be our last slide tonight. And I put this in here because Kate, I said to her, I asked her, I said, what is your favorite book or your favorite illustrator? And she gave me a list. And this was at the top. And I had forgotten about this story. I remember having it read to me in like second and third grade. And also this cartoon, every once in a while you'd see it like on Reading Rainbow. So to see this again is really special. And so tell us a little bit about Dr. DeSoto and what you know about William Steig.
So William Steig was a illustrator for the New Yorker first, was a commercial illustrator. And then as the story is true of many of these like 1960s, 70s children's illustrators, they had a commercial career and then later in life became a children's illustrator because either their grandchildren or children started wanting stories. So they just happened upon this career. So he wrote Dr. DeSoto, which is a very important book to me because, as I said earlier, my granddad was a dentist. And the story is about two mice dentists, a dentist and his mouse wife, and a fox comes in for treatment and he's really, really in pain. And normally they don't serve foxes because they fear getting eaten. So they make this moral decision, where will we serve the fox? And it's a story of sort of outsmarting the fox.
And it takes us back to our whole idea of morals and fables with the mouse taking the thorn out of the lion's paw, and that story that has been around forever and ever and ever, and many different incantations. And so, friends, I want to thank you tonight, or this morning. We normally do Art in Focus in the evening lately virtually, but we are in the morning. So I hope you have a super special day. Thank you for joining us. Kate, thank you for joining us. And I know that I'm going to be inviting you back to pick your brain about a whole bunch of stuff because I think we're on the same page. That'll be the name of our next Art in Focus. Thank you again, everybody. Stay creative and take care. Thank you. And I'm going to play this. Enjoy. Stick around. Take two, everybody. Thank you.
Dr. DeSoto, the dentist, did very good work, so he had no end of patients. Those close to his own size, moles, chipmunks, etc., sat in the regular dentist's chair. Larger animals sat on the floor. For extra large animals, he had a special room. Dr. DeSoto was especially popular with the big animals. He was able to work inside their mouths, wearing rubbers to keep his feet dry. His fingers were so delicate and his drills so dainty, they could hardly feel any pain. Being a mouse, he refused to treat animals dangerous to mice, and it said so on his sign. Dr. DeSoto and his wife wouldn't admit even the most timid-looking cat. One day, when the doorbell rang, they looked out and saw a well-dressed fox with a flannel bandage around his jaw. "I cannot treat you, sir." "Sir, haven't you read my sign?" "Please, have mercy. I'm suffering." "Just a moment." "That poor fox. What shall we do?" "Let's risk it." "Bless your little hearts. I beg you, do something. My tooth is killing me." "Sit on the floor, sir, and remove the bandage, please." Ugh. The fox had a rotten bicuspid and unusually bad breath. This tooth will have to come out, but we can make you a new one.
Just stop the pain.
Keep open, wide open. Despite his misery, the fox realized he had a tasty little morsel in his mouth. I'm giving you gas now. You won't feel a thing when I yank that tooth. Soon the fox was in dreamland.
Yummy. How I love them raw, with just a pinch of salt and a dry white wine.
They could guess what he was dreaming about.
I'm bleeding.
The worst is over. I'll have your new tooth ready tomorrow. Be here at 11 sharp. On his way home, the fox wondered if it would be shabby of him to eat the De Sotos when the job was done. After office hours, Mrs. De Soto molded a tooth of pure gold and polished it. Raw with salt indeed! How foolish to trust a fox! He didn't know what he was saying. Why should he harm us? We're helping him. Because he's a fox. They're wicked, wicked creatures. That night, the De Sotos lay awake, worrying. Should we let him in tomorrow? Once I start a job, I finish it. My father was the same way. But we must do something to protect ourselves. They talked and talked until they formed a plan. The next morning, promptly at 11, a very cheerful fox turned up. He was feeling not a particle of pain.
Just a joke.
No! Be serious. We have work to do. The fox caressed the new tooth with his tongue.
My, it feels good. I really shouldn't eat them. On the other hand, how can I resist?
We are not finished. I have here a remarkable preparation developed only recently by my wife and me. With just one application, you can be rid of toothaches forever. How would you like to be the first one to receive this unique treatment?
I certainly would. I'd be honored.
The fox hated any kind of personal pain. You will never have to see us again.
No one will see you again.
He had definitely made up his mind to eat them, with the help of his brand new tooth. Dr. De Soto stepped into the fox's mouth with a bucket of secret formula and proceeded to paint each tooth. Now, close your jaws tight and keep them closed for a full minute. The fox did as he was told. Then he tried to open his mouth, but his teeth were stuck together. Excuse me, I should have mentioned. You won't be able to open your mouth for a day or two. The secret formula must first permeate the dentine. But don't worry, no pain ever again. The fox was stunned. He stared at Dr. DeSoto, then at his wife. They smiled and waited. All he could do was say,
Thank you very much.
through his clenched teeth, and get up and leave. He tried to do so with dignity. Then he stumbled down the stairs in a daze. Dr. DeSoto and his assistant had outfoxed the fox. They kissed each other and took the rest of the day off.